I'm James Lee Hutchinson. I'm author of four books on World War II and a book on the greatest generation, our childhood before World War II. I'm a retired school teacher. I'm 92 years old, veteran of 20 missions on World War II B-17 bombers. And my purpose is to tell you a little bit about World War II. I come to you today from sort of a person from out of the past, an old man from out of the past. But I want to tell you this my story. I've written five books about veterans in World War II because I've collected these stories and I've saved them for you. The World War II history is so seldom taught in schools today, and there are many people in this generation who have absolutely no information about what happened in the greatest war we've had and the last war we won. And the United States had to fight and protect themselves against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Those three countries were determined to conquer the world, and they had conquered most of it, most of Europe. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Japan had conquered most of the South Pacific islands. And so Italy had been marching into all of his neighbors and also into North Africa. And so perhaps Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it brought us into the war. Our leaders had said, no, we don't want to get involved in the war. Well, Pearl Harbor put us into the war when the Japanese bombed our Pacific fleet, practically bombed it out of existence. And so we started the war with our hands behind our back because the Great Depression had shut down most of our factories, and we didn't have much of an army or a navy. And so it was a battle to regain our armed forces and then to defend ourselves. And luckily we did that by fighting overseas instead of fighting here in the United States. And the 8th Air Force I served in the 8th Air Force. I did 20 missions before I was 20. Now, the way that happened was, I was 17 years old sitting in Bedford High School on June the 11th, 1943, looking forward to finishing my senior year. So June the 12th, I became 18 years old. And June the 13th, I got my draft notice. The high school disappeared, high school diploma disappeared, and I was suddenly in Uncle Sam's Army and trained in one of the greatest educational programs that's ever been formed. The United States military drafted us and trained us. 16 million men and some women went into the service, and we fought a war for 3 years to protect freedom and to protect ourselves from being slaves, because all these people, Germany, Japan, and Italy, had every place they conquered, they killed numerous people and made slaves of the rest of them because they were going to dominate the world. Now, after a year's training, I suddenly found myself in England. We'd gone over on the Queen Mary. Usually the flight crews would take a plane over, but in this case they had plenty of planes. They were interested in men. And so we landed 6-day cruise across the Atlantic on the giant Queen Mary, which could carry about 15,000 troops at a time. And we ended up in Scotland, and the next day we took a train over to England, a little town down in Suffolk, down in the agricultural part of England. There were 42 American air bases there, bomber bases. There were all kinds of American fighter bases. And there were also the Royal Air Force had their bomber bases and fighter bases. So England was just one big airfield. And I can remember standing there that night when we got off the train at it was dark, dingy and a little bit drizzly, and there were 3 crews, 30 men. 10 men to a B-17 crew, and so we waited to be assigned to a Nissen hut or Quonset hut, And none of us realized that 12 men would die and 2 would be wounded. And so our 3 crews met the 50% loss average. The 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 airmen. It had the highest losses of any military unit in the United States. So I thought it might take you on a cruise, take you on a bombing mission. I might call it through the Flak and back, because we had this 10-man crew. I had this B-17, which is basically an aluminum tube with 4 big motors on it, and we crowded 10 men into it. We were dressed for 40 below zero, and since we were flying at 25,000 feet, we had to have oxygen. So when we got dressed and ready to go, we looked about like the Pillsbury Doughboy. We had our long underwear, our electric suit, and all the heavy suit we could find, plus a parachute harness, a Mae West life jacket in case we got shot down in the sea. And once we got on the plane, then we put on a flak jacket, 45-pound flak jacket, sort of an apron front and back. And we had a steel helmet with little deer flaps to cover our headsets. And each man had his own position, and each man had his own oxygen supply. And once we reached 5,000 feet, we had to put on the oxygen. And so the routine was that they would tell you the night before that you were going to fly a mission. And then they get you up about 3 o'clock the next morning, and you'd dress, go down to the mess hall, eat a fine meal. They always gave you a good meal, because we always said it might be our last meal. And we knew we weren't going to eat again until the mission was over, which would be 7 to 8 hours total. From the mess hall, we went on down to the briefing room, where they gathered us together and pulled a huge curtain off of a huge map on the wall and said, okay, this is where you're going today, and this is the route you will fly, and this is where the flak guns are. Now the flak guns were our nemesis, because the flak, they could shoot those 88 millimeter cannons 5 mile high. They could reach us, and they had radar sights on them. So we had to avoid any flak. If we knew where flak guns were, if our intelligence had reported where flak guns were, then we had to avoid that and move in. So the map basically said, here's your road map. You fly this way and this way and this way. You go in, you bomb the target, and you come back out. Now they also told us where the fighters might be, because the Germans had a very good Air Force, very good planes, and they had toward the end they had a jet. They had a twin-engine jet. But our mission was to get all of our equipment, get on the plane. Now the plane had already been loaded. The B-17, the day before, the night before, the ground crew had put in the bombs. And of course the bombs didn't have the fuses in them, but they were all loaded into the plane. All the 50 caliber ammunition was loaded into the plane. The B-17 had a 10-man crew average, and and this drawing will show you that tail gunner, 2 waist gunners, a radio gunner, a top turret gunner, a nose gunner. We were pretty well loaded. In fact, they called the B-17 the Flying Fortress, because we had 13 50 caliber machine guns, and we could protect ourselves quite well. By the time I got there, they had put a chin turret on the nose, and that was an extra protection, but a couple of twin 50 caliber guns on that chin turret could be operated by the bombardier. So once we got up and had breakfast and had briefing and went to the equipment room and got our parachutes and whatever else they wanted us to carry, 45 automatic, etc. And we got out to the plane, and everybody had to get in his position, get set for the mission, and then they lined up the planes, and we took off on that runway about every 2 or 3 minutes. We were just lined up like parked cars and become taken off. Well, you try to get that B-17 into the air with all those bombs, all that ammunition on it, plus the weight of the plane itself. And it was a chore to get that plane lifted off the runway in time. And sometimes they didn't make it, and they just pulled off to the left and slid into the mud. But and flying, the mission itself was dangerous, but the first danger came just getting off the ground. The next danger came getting up in the air over England and reforming into your bomb group, because each of those 42 bomb groups would try to send out a formation of 36 planes. You flew in a formation of high, middle, and low, and it was always staggered. You were always staggered here and here and here over here, so you couldn't drop bombs on each other. But the other reason was that the machine guns on each plane had a wider range to fire against attacking fighters. Now, when we first started to bomb Germany and France, the Germans had the best Air Force, they had the best fighters, and they would send those things up and our bombers did not have escort planes to protect them all the way to the target. In the first 43, half of 44, our fighter planes, to protect the bombers, could only go halfway to the target. Then they had to come back because they didn't have enough gas, enough fuel to get all the way to the target and home. The German fighters knew about where the range was, and so they would sit up there and wait. And the minute our fighters turned back, then our bombers had to fight their way to the target and fight their way back to where our fighters could pick them up again. That's when the 8th Air Force had such heavy losses. And of course, every time a B-17 went down, you lost 10 men or more. By the time I got there in November 1944, we had fighter protection. Somebody had thought of the bright idea of inventing fuel tanks for the fighters, and so they put fuel tanks on all of our fighters. They could escort us all the way to the target, wait for us to drop our bombs, and then pick us up. Now, making yourself to the target, even though you had the fighter protection, we got hit 2 times. We got hit on our 12th mission and again on our 14th or 15th. It's in the book. I can't remember all those details. But the thing is, even though we were protected, we still had the fighters slip in after us. But the big thing was the Flak. Now, the Flak, there were 18 millimeter shells about this long, and the German anti-aircraft guns would shoot those things up and they would explode just like a giant shotgun shell. And if they were even close to you, then the little pellets about the size of your thumbs, iron pellets, would come riddling through the plane. And if the men in the plane had on their flak jackets and their helmets and they were lucky, they were protected that far. But if a lot of them weren't that lucky, and a lot of men were injured or killed, even though the plane stayed in the air. And so we had that problem of flak all the way. We never knew when we might hit it. But when that shell came up and it exploded, you had a big black puff of smoke with a red fire in the center. Then here come the flak. And of course, as I said, they had their radar sights and they could put it right on us. And they could track us. Now the problem was when we got to the target area, they of course knew we were coming. And the requirement on a B-17 or any B-24 or any heavy bombers, you had to locate yourself about 20 or 15 miles away from the target. You had to turn the plane over to the bombardier, and his bomb sight became the automatic pilot. It worked off the automatic pilot, and he actually had control of the plane, and he had to keep it completely level for 15 or 20 minutes to get into that target. And what you were doing, you were looking out in front and just seeing a sky full of exploding shells, black smoke, and you were flying into it. Now, you learn to pray pretty hard when you see fighters coming at you, spitting red fire out of their wings. But when you see that flak exploding all around you and the sky just filled with death, then you really learn to pray. And you just know that you're going to have to fly into it. You have to open your bomb bay doors and drop your bomb load, and then get through the flak and out. And sometimes the German fighters were waiting for you out there. And of course, we always had radio contact with our fighters, so if we came out of the target and found fighters, we could call for help. But flak would take down a plane. It would take out a motor, or it would hit something and catch it on gas tank or something and catch it on fire. And so we had lost so many planes that way, and it was just sort of a terrifying thing, but yet you knew that you had to do it because you had raised your right hand and sworn to defend your country. And if you refused to get on that plane, they would have slapped you in jail or maybe even charge you with desertion and put you in prison. But so we flew, even though we knew what was happening and we knew the chances were very slim. But my job as radio operator was to make certain reports as we reached a certain place over Germany, over enemy territory. I had to send in a report, well, we're here. Then we'd get a little farther, I'd send in another one here. And then when we got ready to start the bomb run, that was called the initial point. And we had to tell the base, okay, we're here, we're starting the bomb run. And then everything was quiet. My only other job was to monitor and make sure if they called us back or warned us of something, then I was told the pilot. The thing I was using was the Morse code, which is a dit-aw, 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 dit thing. You couldn't use voice radio in those days, and we didn't have cell phones. And so I was the contact man. Each radio man on each plane was the contact man back to the base. But we were flying lead crew, and so I was the contact man for whichever squadron we were flying in. We had a lead crew in the top squadron, the middle squadron, and the low squadron. And so you had command pilots. We were the point. It was sort of a dubious honor because we were the lead plane, and that was the one the fighters wanted to get down, or the flak was always at the front. And so we had a command pilot, and a command navigator, and a command bombardier. We had supposed to have the best and most experienced guys in the lead plane. And we did that for 14 of our missions were lead plane, which was quite different. And as I said, we went over on the Queen Mary, about 15,000 of us. We got our barracks, we got assigned to our barracks. We flew the mission in, we came back. Coming back, at one point we lost, one of our gunners was hit in his helmet, he lost his eye. Of course the blood froze right away, we were 40 below zero, the blood froze right away. We gave him a shot of morphine and he was fine, wrapped him up for shock and he was fine. Our ball turret gunner got taken off our plane and put on another plane, and so he ended up as a casualty. That plane was shot down 11 days before the war ended. That plane was shot down, and the German SS troops were the people who captured and killed 8 men 11 days before the war ended. So you know that was just brutality. One of the things I stressed, besides the fact that we were always on edge and always worried, was the fact that you could pray, and your folks at home were praying. And I always say, well, my mother's prayers, and maybe my prayers, and maybe my lucky ring. I have this Air Cadet ring that I wore on all my missions. In those days when everybody went to the service, single men, married men, if you were between the ages of 18 and 35, you were subject to the draft. And so this little Bible, this little New Testament, had an iron metal cover on it. And they sold an awful lot of those because the idea was the soldier would wear this in his pocket. And I did, because I was in the air and sitting quietly at a radio desk. Of course, the guys on the ground probably didn't have time to carry it with them. So among my souvenirs, besides my ring and my little New Testament, armor-plated New Testament, and one of the 50 caliber bullets that we used to shoot at them. I don't have a piece of flak. Luckily, I lucked out and never caught a piece of flak. So that perhaps that's the way we got through it. The other thing we knew is, and I have lots of stories about boys who were shot down, and civilians would, if they parachuted down, and the civilians got them, they'd probably beat them to death. If the German soldiers got you, they would save you, rescue you, and take you for interrogation. Then they would put you in a POW, a prisoner of war camp, where you suffered starvation and everything else. So it was just a brutal war. And perhaps the most brutal part of it, the thing that spurred us on all the time, was the fact that Germany, Hitler had been a genocide program of killing all the Jews. And he started that in 1934, 36, and he was actually killed they killed 6 million Jews in their killing camps. Now, a concentration camp was different from a POW camp. If a concentration camp was for the Jews, the homosexuals, the people who disagreed with Hitler, anybody he wanted killed, he just put them in those camps. And they had 14 or 15 of them. And then they had farm camps out from that. So they actually became slaves, and the strong ones became slaves. The weak ones they just gassed and put into the fiery furnaces. And we discovered all that later on too. So I have to mention that as one of the reasons we knew we had to win. The Japanese were about the same in the Pacific area, and it was not a pretty war. And I guess power corrupts you, and the more power you get, the more you want. But the German people actually took photographs of everything they did to these poor people. They took photographs of the gas chambers. They took photographs of the furnaces where they burned the bodies. They took photographs of the ditches where they lined up people and shot them in the head and threw them in the ditch and buried them up. So they killed a lot more than 6 million Jews, because the Germans Hitler had a goon squad that followed his troops, and the troops would capture a town, and the goon squads would come in and kill all the Jews. But they always took pictures to document how effective they were in killing people. And that was the real reason we got down to that. But it was the same thing in the Pacific. Different people were killed and murdered. In Italy the same way. In Africa, he killed a lot of African tribesmen. He killed anybody who stood in his way. And it was a time when, and we were doing the same thing in reverse. We were killing for revenge and to protect ourselves. We dropped bombs on factories. We dropped bombs on railroads. We dropped bombs on airfields. Any place we could destroy their ability to have a war. In other words, we had to take away their military plants. And they had some in caves back under the mountains. They built those bombs, those guided missile bombs. They built those things in caves and hauled them out and sent them off toward England. But we were doing the same thing. We were trained to kill. We were killing people. We were dropping bombs. We were wiping out everything. And World War II was just as a horrible war. All war is horrible. And so that's why we try to avoid it now. But that war was a war we had to win, and we came out of it. And I always say, well, we came out of it maybe because before the war, we had no unemployment. We had practically nothing. People lived from hand to mouth and lived in huts, and they had houses that didn't have water or electricity, and they had a very shortage of food. You didn't have a lot of food to eat, and so when we grew up, we were lean and mean. I'm the same height I am now, but when I went in the service, I weighed 150 pounds at age 18. And today at age 92, I weigh about 235. So maybe we won that war because we were hungry. We wanted, the mess hall was my favorite place. We ate a lot of good food. But that's my story. And When we came back, we'd drop the bombs and we'd come back, and there'd be wounded men on the plane, so they'd land first. There'd be planes that were damaged, and they got to land next. And some of them would land and make it, and others would slide off the runway and explode. And some didn't come back at all because they went down over the target or on the way back. If you were in a formation and you dropped your bombs and you came out and flak had damaged you and you had to lag behind the formation, you were called fighter bait because they would come and get you. The German fighters would shoot you down right away. And so toward the end of the war, we had bases in France and Belgium where we could, if a crippled plane could make it back to that, he could land and be safe. Early in the war, you had to make it all the way back to England. So I show slides of explosions, slides of guns, gunfire, fighter attacks, slides of planes trying to make it home and not making it. Some planes would ditch in the ocean, ditch in the North Sea, and that plane would sink in about three minutes or less. So if you had to come into the water, you landed like this, hit the water, and it'd flatten out, and everybody would scramble out. And we had little rubber boats we could get into, but you could also freeze to death. It was a time of war where people who survived realized what had happened, and they came back home and they were ready to work. We still had the war factories; all the factories were here, so we converted and we started making refrigerators and washing machines and televisions instead of guns and ammunition, and we just became the greatest generation. And we had a bunch of kids, and they were the baby boomers, and now the baby boomers have had a bunch of kids, and their kids have had kids, and now we've reached the point where very few people are living who remember what really happened in World War II. And so that's why I do this. I don't make a lot of money selling books. I try to pay for the cost of publishing the thing, but it's just fun to talk with people and educate people. I said I taught for 37 years, so I just keep teaching. Thank you very much.